Math 100 Lesson 6-1, greatest common factor and factor by grouping. So factoring is a huge part of Math 100, and this is a topic that you will use if you have to go on to any other math courses after Math 100. Factoring will be super important to you. So before we actually dive into factoring, I want to review with you the distributive property. This is something we've actually already covered. The distributive property is when we multiply through a set of parentheses, that is something we have been doing. So we multiply A through these parentheses to get AB plus AC. And so I do want you to remember the distributive property, and then when we think about factoring, factoring would be the opposite operation. So now I'm going to write, we're going to factor out the common factor. All right, so we're going to use the answer that we got above after distributing. And so if we're asked to factor out the common factor, our common factor in this particular problem would be the A. So when I factor it out, I'm going to pull it out front, and I factor it out using division. So that would essentially leave me with B plus C. Now I'm going to show you up here what I actually did. We took AB, we factored out A. We took AC, and we factored out A. So when you factor out, it's like you're doing division, and that leaves me with this B plus C. So A times B plus C would be the factored out version. Okay, so let's go on to doing some greatest common factor, known as the GCF, okay, the greatest common factor. And let's start with something like 18x cubed and 15x squared for our greatest common factor. Now, what I like to do, and you don't necessarily have to write it like this, but I like to think of all of the factors. Okay, so if I took 18 and I factored it out, I know that 2 times 9 is 18, and then there's nothing else that goes into 2. 9 is 3 times 3, and then nothing else goes into 3. So 18 is 2 times 3 times 3, and now I had x cubed up there, so I also need to include that. All right, now I'm going to do the 15. I know that 15 is 3 times 5. Nothing else goes into 3 or into 5. So we call those prime numbers. So we have 3 times 5, and we still have the x squared. Now all I've done so far is write out some prime factors. In order to choose the greatest common factor here, we choose the largest thing that they have in common. Okay, so I can only choose what they have in common. Well, they both have a 3. All right, so I'm definitely going to take a 3 for my greatest common factor. Okay, they both have an x value, but we need to pay attention to their exponents, right? X cubed is really x squared times x, which means they both have an x squared. So I multiply by x squared. My greatest common factor is 3x squared. You can only take what they have in common. Let's try another one. this time I'm going to give you 3 terms, and we're going to find the greatest common factor again. But we've got these 3 terms. Now I told you didn't have to write out the factors the way that I did. You could write it any other way that you wanted to. Let's say I write it differently, and I write down all the numbers that go into 20. Well, I know that -1, 2, 4, 5, 10, and 20 all go into -20. If I write down all the numbers that go into 12, 1, 2, 3, 4, 6, and 12. And then if I write down all the numbers that go into 40, 1, 2, 4, 5, 8, 10, 20, and 40. Now this way can get pretty lengthy, because let's say that these numbers had been 250, 496, and 732, which is a possibility. So this way can get really, really lengthy. So this is not the best method for doing this. I just wanted to show you that is another option. All right. So if I stick with what I just showed you a moment ago, and we say 20 is 2 times 10. Now this little negative sitting out here, I'm going to rewrite this as -1 times 20x squared. And so I go ahead and take that 1 out. All right, so I've got my 2, nothing else I can multiply to get 2. All right, so -20x squared gives me -1 times 2 times 2 times 5 times x squared. All right, now let's do 12x to the 4th. 3 times 4. Now let's say you chose 2 times 6. We're still going to end up with the same final answer. Now I circle these because nothing else goes into them. That's why I circle them. Okay, I'm going to write 12x to the 4th down here, which would be 2 times 2 times 3 times x to the 4th. All right, and then our last one is 40x cubed. 40 is 4 times 10. Now both of those can be simplified, so I'm not going to circle either one of them. Okay, I know that 4 is 2 times 2, and then 5 times 2 is our 10. So 40x cubed would be 2 times 2 times 2 times 5 times x cubed. Now let's say that you wanted to write out these x's just to keep you from being confused. The first one has 2 x's, the next one has 4 of them, and then the last one has 3 of them. All right, so greatest common factor means I take the biggest thing that they have in common. Okay, well they all have a 2, so I have to take that. So my greatest common factor, I'll write it over here. We're going to take that 2 for sure. They have it in common. Well, notice here, they all have another 2. So I have to take it also. They don't all have a 5. They don't all have a 3. And they don't all have another 2. So I'm done there. When I look at my variables, they all have 1x. They all have another x, and that's it, because the -20x squared doesn't have a third x. So our greatest common factor here, we multiply these numbers and we get 4x squared. That would be our greatest common factor, 4x squared. All right, so the reason we have to be able to factor numbers is because we're going to be given expressions and asked to factor those. So let's say I ask you to factor 6x squared plus 18. Now what that means is that we are first going to find the greatest common factor. of each term. Okay. So let's see, what is the greatest common factor of 6x squared and 18? My greatest common factor is 6. That's the largest number that goes into 6 and into 18. If you need to write out all of the little steps, that is fine. We're going to get our greatest common factor is 6. Okay, so we found our greatest common factor. It is 6. So that's what we're going to factor out in the top. We factor it out just like we did before when I said factor out the common factor. When you factor it out from the problem, it's by division. So we will be left with x squared plus 3. Think about checking it with the distributive property. If I check this by distributing back through, will I end up with my original equation? And if I do, then I factored it correctly. In this case, I did. Okay. Let's do one a little bit bigger. 8x cubed y squared minus 14x squared y plus 2xy. All right, so again, it asked me to factor. So I need to first find the greatest common factor. So I'm looking for the largest number that goes into 8, 14, and 2. So that is only going to be a 2. And we can't forget about our variables. I'm sorry, I read this problem incorrectly. I wanted a y right there also. So when I look at their variables, they all have one x. They also all have one y. So my greatest common factor is 2xy. So I'm going to factor out 2xy and see what we have left. Okay, when you factor it out, you think division. So 8 divided by 2 leaves me with 4. X cubed divided by x, I subtract the exponents. Y squared divided by y, I subtract the exponents. Negative 14 divided by 2 would be a negative 7. X squared divided by x, I subtract my exponents. And then y divided by y gives me a 1, so that divides out. 2 divided by 2 gives me a plus 1. The x divided by x gives me 1, and y divided by y gives me 1. So this would be my final factored answer for this problem. Okay, moving on. Okay, sometimes in my math lab, they are going to ask you to factor out the negative greatest common factor. The negative greatest common factor. Okay. So here's our problem. So again, we have to first find the greatest common factor, the largest number that goes into 16, 24, and 20. And that largest number is a 4, but it asked me to factor out the negative greatest common factor. I just found my greatest common factor was 4, but it asked me to use negative. So I'm definitely going to factor out negative 4. Okay, now we have to pay attention to our variables. We have an a to the 4th, an a cubed, and an a. So I can only take what they have in common, which is an a. B to the 5th, b to the 4th, and b squared. They all have a b squared. Okay, so that would be my greatest common factor, negative 4ab squared. When you factor it out, you do that by dividing. So negative 16 divided by negative 4 is positive 4. A to the 4th divided by a is a cubed. B to the 5th divided by b squared. Remember, we subtract our exponents. And 5 minus 2 is a 3. Okay, so we should have 4a cubed, b cubed. Positive 24 divided by negative 4 gives me a negative 6. A cubed divided by a would give me a squared. Subtract the exponents, and we get a b squared. Subtract those exponents. Negative 20 divided by negative 4 gives me a positive 5. A divided by a gives me 1. And b squared divided by b squared gives me 1. So this would be my final answer. So those are examples of just factoring. You're taking out the greatest common factor. Right, this one's going to look a little different. Our directions are still factor. All right, and when you look at this expression, here's what I'd like for you to see. I'd like for you to see you have two terms here. Those two terms are separated by that plus in the middle. All right? So what do my two terms have in common? Well, they both have an x plus 1. So I'm going to factor out the x plus 1, and I will multiply by what is left. If I factor out x plus 1 from this first term, I would only be left with the x squared. Okay, now I bring down this little plus sign. If I factored out x plus 1 from this second term, I would only be left with a 7. So my answer is x plus 1 times x squared plus 7. Now they won't always be factored out so nicely right here, having that looking at you so that you can obviously see the x plus 1. So let's try one. That it's not quite so obvious. All right, so anytime we're asked to factor, first we look for, is there a greatest common factor of all the terms? In this case, there is not. Okay, there's not a greatest common factor. All right, so then I ask myself, all right, there are 4 terms here. Let's put our 4 terms in groups. Okay, so here's what I mean by putting them in groups. Let's take these two and form a group, and then let's take these two and that's formed a second group. So let's look at it one group at a time. If we look at this first group, they do have a greatest common factor. It would be x squared. When I divide it out, I would be left with x plus 5. All right, I'm going to bring down this plus sign. And then I'm going to factor out what these two have in common. They both have a 2 in common. When I factor that out, I would be left with an x plus 5. Now what we have looks very similar to the problem above. We've got our 2 groups. Okay, we still have those 2 groups, and both groups have an x plus 5. Okay, here's our 2 groups. They both have this x plus 5. So I'm going to factor x plus 5 out and multiply by what would be left once I factor it. I would be left with this x squared in the first group, and I would be left with this 2 in the second group. So there would be our answer. What we just did is called factor by grouping. Factor by grouping. We do this when there are 4 terms. Notice in our original problem, there were 4 terms. X cubed plus 5x squared plus 2x plus 10. We use factor by grouping. That is the wrong form of that word. Factor by grouping when there are 4 terms. All right, so let's try another one. So when we look at these, first we look for the greatest common factor of all the terms. There's not one. So that part's taken care of. And then we ask ourselves, should I group this thing? Like, are there 4 terms? There are 4 terms. So yes, I am going to group them. Okay. So I'm going to put the first 2 in a group and the second 2 in a group. Okay, so I look at the first group, and what do they have as far as a common factor? They have an x. When I factor it out, I would be left with a y plus 3. Okay, in my next group, I'm going to factor out a negative 5. They both have a negative 5. I would be left with positive y plus 3. Remember, we're dividing, so negative 15 divided by negative 5 is a positive 3. So now we have our 2 groups. In our groups, they both have a y plus 3. So I factor out the y plus 3. I multiply by what is left, the x minus 5. So this would be my solution. So that is factor by grouping. Always look for the greatest common factor first. And then if there are 4 terms, we can put them in groups and try to factor that way. So that was all for lesson 1. We will do some more. When we get to section 2, it will not be by grouping, but we will still be factoring. Hope to see you in teams.